research hub, as you would read in the write-up and as we'll cover today, is an idea that we have been under discussion with at CHRIPS for, I think, since last year. After realizing it was, we were doing some work, and then it was becoming difficult to start getting materials. People are doing a lot of work, but we couldn't get a centralized system of where do we get this information. Sometimes we could get things that were in duplicate in terms of the materials, and we thought it's good for us to start thinking of how can we possibly have an online platform where people could be sharing a lot of the materials on CVE, a lot of the good research that is going on in the academic and the policy world, the NGO sector. And that's how this initiative came along. So it's still a very much work in progress, as you'll see in the later part of the day. It's still work that we are continuing. I'm sure you've met my colleagues Rahma and Angeline in your areas, and I think they came to visit and see how you are faring on. So it's part also of the engagement to know who is doing what and how are we continuing. But also it's recognizing that also there are other many initiatives, similar networking partnerships that are going on in the counties, and also some others in the national platforms. So the idea is, as part of the day, the last part of the day is how do we, enhance all these partnerships? How do we not duplicate? How do we collaborate? How do we strengthen each other? Because all of us have our own different strengths. So that's a big idea that we have within the CVE Research Hub. And on behalf of CHRIPS, is to welcome all of you, is to say thank you also for availing your time, your resources. We've got quite a number of resources that we have started uploading online. We'll share with you today and see how we are progressing.
Basically now just a few looking back at where we've come from. You remember a lot of the discussions at the policy and at the research level really peaks around from 2001, and particularly after September 11, when we have the attacks in the US. That's not to say we did not have problems of terrorism before, but this is when now the US leadership and the coalition of Western countries and other countries in what comes up in what is known as the global war on terrorism. And you remember that the initial focus of this was actually military. So after September 11 is when we see the military coalition that goes to Afghanistan, and after that goes to Iraq, and after that there was more consideration that actually the next target countries ought to be countries that are seen as sponsors of terrorism. So a very militaristic approach to how to deal with the problems of terrorism that was seen as challenging and posing a threat to the security of particularly Western countries. Other countries beyond the West also became part of this coalition, even if not militarily, but in terms of passing legislation that looked very similar to the Patriot Act. So those of you who have been following on the developments in Kenya, you remember we started discussions around 2003 in terms of passing a legislation to counter terrorism in this country. It wasn't until 2012, eventually, when the legislation was passed. But actually, the discussions go back further, and they were part of the export of these ideas, particularly from the West, from the US and the rest of the countries. That countries needed to pass legislation, countries needed to reorient and retool their law enforcement agencies so that they can intercept, interdict, and prevent the work of terrorists globally.
My presentation is not mine, it is yours. You're the one who will be telling us more about what has been happening to you, whether the context has been changing, whether there are other factors beyond CVE that are influencing your security, and who else do you think you need to be working with or you're working with, and whom do we need to bring on board?
All right, I can just put it in the two perspectives. One is when violent extremism has been on an alarming stage, that's around 2015. And I think from most of the reports that originates from Human Rights Watch and Kenya National Commission, we have seen how violent extremism has been active in northern part of Kenya, and Wajir was included. So at that time, talking about CVE was seen by the security agencies as if you are an Al-Shabaab sympathizer.
Thank you.
And then the possibility of you being victimized is very high. Secondly, there are people who maybe want to score goals against an individual, and then they take wrong information to the police. I just give you a scenario that there was a person who had a business rival with another one, and then his car has traveled to the border point, if I don't know if you know him yet. It was coming back. Then the police was informed, the security agencies, that that car is packed with explosives. So an order was given that it was to be shot on sight. And the actual sense, there was nothing in that car. So in that kind of situation, it was bad. But later on, when things have subsided, we took two approaches. One, we wanted to change the government approach in handling violent extremism. And relatively now building a consensus between the local community and the government agencies, the security agencies.
Thank you so much. I want to cut you short up to that level because you've already mentioned two things that are likely to happen to you. You might be seen to be an Al-Shabaab sympathizer, and two, if there's another person who you do not see eye to eye, they might use that connotation to ensure that you're targeted. Thank you. As a woman working on CVE issues, other than the two, what are we likely to see happening, especially when we are focusing on Garissa?
Apart from the CVE, one of the things that's leading people to be radicalized is difficulty in accessing government services. So you see, the people in Garissa, they have this difficulty getting the birth certificates, IDs, and those. So that's the major reason I think that's leading them to join violent extremists. And another thing is that
Thank you. Before I go to Lamu, let me come to Kwale first.
I don't know, I came in with the identity of Kwale because we work in 3 other counties.
No, I want us to focus on Kwale.
Yeah, interesting that I have that type of identity. Yeah, but of course we do a lot of work on CVE in Kwale. And like our colleague from Garissa said, I think for human rights defenders, it's very risky to do this kind of work because of some of the pieces of legislation that we have in this country. Basically, you know, when you engage with, for instance, returnees or foreign fighters, you are seen to be in one way or the other abetting, you know, terrorism and all that. So all our work is actually at risk. I remember some time back, I even communicated with you when we had an incident between ourselves and Citizen TV. We wanted to do a feature on returnees, the safety of returnees. So we, you know, politely helped them out to get information and to get in touch with the returnees. But later on, it turned out to be a very risky affair for us because they never conducted the whole feature properly. So some of the faces and voices were not distorted as they were supposed to be. So the whole issue again turned out to be very risky for us because then we were targeted by law enforcement agencies and the safety of the returnees themselves was also at stake. Yeah. So those are the kind of issues that we're dealing with in Kwale.
Thank you.
But also, most importantly, and this probably is a question for you, would you consider detainees who have surrendered as part of human rights defenders? Yeah, because, and what kind of support would you possibly give them in this kind of environment? Because they're also at risk. We work with them, and by extension, our interaction with them also puts them at risk and puts us at risk.
How we are going to run this morning is that we're going to have a few presentations, then we are going to open it up for plenary conversations. One of the questions to ask is how relevant the whole notion and concept of CVE is going to be and will continue to be in the near future. In other words, when looking at what we are doing on the ground, what is the value added of the concept of countering violent extremism? One is that from the data we have been collecting over the last couple of years, we see an apparent reduced activity with regard to Al-Shabaab attacks on the Kenyan soil. The other interesting development is the arenas and the theaters where this is taking place. You remember that in 2013, 2014, a lot of these activities was taking place in Kenya, in Nairobi, in major urban centers in Kenya, in Mombasa. What we have seen in the recent past is that a lot of this activity has shifted to mostly the border regions of the country. The third interesting development from what we are seeing in the data is in the previous years we saw a number of arrests and attribution of attacks to non-Kenyan citizens. In the recent past, most of those who have been arrested with regard to Al-Shabaab activity, many of them have actually been Kenyan citizens. And increasingly, therefore, it does appear from the data that there is an increased domestic recruitment as well as mobilization of Kenyan citizens themselves who then either cross into Somalia, they lead these attacks, or they come back and lead these attacks. And the third is with regard to the models and the distinctions that we can make from looking at the models of intervention of dealing with the CVE. Yesterday we were talking about the Danish model, Aarhus model that has been promoted quite broadly as a possible model of countering violence extremism. But let me begin by saying, from what we know from literature, there are no good models out there. And you look at the global studies around these questions, whether it is the recent work done by UNDP, whether it is the work being done globally, there are no good models. This is an area that is evolving, and there are no best practices. Very finally, is what we have seen in the recent past at the national level in Kenya with regard to an embrace of a CVE approach, less of a purely countering terrorism and a recognition, at least at the policy level, through the national strategy for countering violence extremism, that there are other approaches that needs to be undertaken. And we've seen also counties pick up that to develop county CVE strategies. I think there are about 7 or so. And I can see a lot of people in this room who have been very critical in the development of those plans.
My name is Irene Dongo. I'm a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. I'll be presenting on a study we conducted last year, looking at the role of women, the involvement of women in violent extremism. So that's the title of the study. The study was commissioned by the UN Women Kenya Country Office. We did the study from September to December for the fieldwork, and then this year was when we were putting the findings together. It was funded through the support of the Japanese government. So my key message to you this morning is that we need to prioritize the voices of women in our work, those impacted and affected by violent extremism, and to let the experiences more visible in our work because they do matter, and it's important that we also hear from them and from get their own perspectives in terms of their experiences. So, as you may be aware, Kenya has suffered over 200 terror attacks since 2008, which has resulted in the deaths of over 500 people and injuries to thousands of people. But these are astounding figures, and we have no idea how women are involved either as perpetrators or as facilitators or enablers in some of these attacks. In Africa, and Kenya is also no exception. And for example, one of the prominent cases was when some 3 girls were arrested across the border on their way to Somalia. There was 1 Tanzanian and 2 Kenyans, and reports differ as to their motivation. Some say they were going there as jihadi brides, as others claim that they were going there as suicide bombers, or they were being lured to go there as concubines. So we conducted the study. So the aim of the study was, sorry, I'm skipping some of the slides. I don't know, it's not appearing. Yeah, so the aim of the study was to gain insights into the context-specific and gendered impacts of radicalization and PCV on women's lives and the varied roles that women play in violent extremism in Kenya. This is to allow the field, those working in the field, to have an evidence base from which to inform their interventions. Kenya Women, the UN Women Kenya Country Office in particular, wanted to find out what's happening before they can design their programs or seek ways to intervene in terms of working with women affected. So the study, in terms of the methodology, was guided by 3 key research questions. One looked at the roles, the other looked at the impact, and the third question was looking at the responses to violent extremism. So the first question was, what are the varied roles that women play in radicalization and violent extremism? And what are the life events and processes that led them to become engaged? The other question looked at the impact. What is the impact of radicalization and violent extremism on women? And also the third question, in terms of responses, how do current responses to violent extremism, both in terms of policies and interventions, address or hinder the possible roles that women play in violent extremism in Kenya? So the geographical scope of the study was, we went to Garissa, we also visited Lamu, Mombasa and Kwale. In Kwale we went to Diani and Tiwi. We also visited Nairobi, Majengo and Isili in particular. Garissa, I think I'm missing something. But also went to Western Kenya where we visited Busia and Kisumu. So the limitations of the study were the time frame. We had very little time to gather very good data and also to build trust with possible respondents. And then also conceptualizing key terms to fit the local context. As you know, there's no translation for violent extremism, for example. So many people associate it with terrorism. And then language barriers are also an issue. Most of the respondents, the women, spoke in Swahili, so we had to translate that into English. In terms of the impact, for the sake of time, let me just quickly read through that. So the psychological impact, especially as a result of victimization from sexual and gender-based violence. All the returnees we spoke to had experienced sexual assault, rape. In fact, one of them had contracted HIV as a result. There was also extreme worry and anxiety by all the women we spoke to, especially those that had children or husbands implicated one way or another. Another interesting finding was that the families of security officers were also very heavily psychologically affected, and I think this is one of the areas we actually need to interrogate. Also, economic impact, especially if the women are depending on their sons or their husbands for livelihoods, and then also the economic decline in the areas that experience attacks. So women experience all these kinds of economic impact as a result of the loss of livelihoods and decline in business activities in their communities. The social impact as well, there's a lot of stigmatization, especially for women whose sons or children or husbands are implicated in one way or another. Maybe they have children in jail or suspects, children who've been suspected. So many women were saying that they feel ostracized by members of the community. So in terms of the responses, the government has articulated and demonstrated a willingness to engage with civil society, donors and the impacted communities in PCVE. But although some good practices exist, current responses to violent extremism in Kenya by the government, donors and civil society are neither gender-specific nor sensitive. Recommendations for civil society, actually many, but one that stood out for me is that we should avoid over-researching the same respondents. Especially women kept complaining about how they feel that they are providing so much feedback, but they don't see any result as a result of all the studies that we're conducting. So I think we have a challenge there, and also a responsibility, and also to follow up on implementation of some of the findings we come up from our research, and also to constructively critique and engage the government through various means, including forums and partnerships.
My name is Yusuf Lule, and I work for an organization called Human Rights Agenda, Huria, and we are based at the coast. Our offices in Mombasa, and we have been working on issues of countering violent extremism for the last 5 years. Issues or incidents of terror and violent extremism at the coast are mostly registered around 4 counties. County number 1 is Kwale, then we have Mombasa, we have Kilifi and Lamu. Very few incidences have been registered over time in Tana River and Taita Taveta. But with the changing patterns and trends, we have also observed recently some incidences in some parts of Taita Taveta. Because for quite some time, people have been looking at Taita Taveta and some parts also, some interior parts of Kwale as safe havens, because a lot of surveillance is happening in the 4 counties, coastline counties. So most of these suspected terrorists or young people who are involved in issues of radicalization and extremism relocate to other places. We've seen it happening also in Mombasa, in some parts of Majengo, where young people who have been under surveillance for quite some time relocating to some parts of Malindi. So there are more active cells in Malindi than it was before. So basically that's where violent extremism incidences and terror are happening within the coast region. So how has civil society responded to some of these things that are happening at the coast? Number 1, there is a lot of training and capacity building of stakeholders on CVE. Another approach is social media and online campaigns and messaging on CVE. Many organizations at the coast are also doing this part of work. You've had 1 or 2 people mentioning Huria as part of the best practice that uses social media in countering violent extremism and online campaigns. Number 3, as part of the intervention or strategies that are being used by civil society organizations at the coast, policy formulation. I think we all know that civil society organizations have taken lead, have given stewardship in the development of county CVE action plans. The first one was developed in Kwale, spearheaded by ourselves, Human Rights Agenda, and a number of scholars from within the coast region. And then the other one was also developed in Mombasa County CVE Action Plan, Kilifi and Lamu.
I'm going to speak about the research that BRICS has done over time. And BRICS is Building Resilience in Civil Society. It's an acronym. And under BRICS, we have the IU, which is the implementation unit, and the regional research unit that I come from. And we have done research over time. And we have 15 partners who are working in, we have 16 partners, 15 in Kenya, working in Isiolo, Nairobi, one possibly in Garissa, Mombasa, Kwale, partly in Lamu. And we are working on different things. We work on community security, meeting the at-risk groups. And as BRICS, we work hand in hand with partners and leaders in the community levels to understand the drivers to violent extremism, learn what happened, learn how and why change happens to the at-risk populations, and try and positively influence the at-risk groups and the key influencers who reach out to the at-risk groups, and try and broadly or apply the learning that we have to other people doing CVE work in the different places. In terms of the state of research in Kenya, one thing that we are seeing, and if you do right now Google about CVE in Kenya, there's a high chance that you're going to get a lot about the macro level drivers, that is unemployment, IDs, marginalization, and less on the at-risk groups. And therefore, the kind of proposals that you'll find, or the suggestions and recommendations, tend to target the macro level drivers. And as BRICS, we are trying to target the at-risk. And we are saying that the at-risk individuals tend to be primarily identified currently with the research that is going on broadly. You'll find, since the drivers are macro level, you would find the demographics that define youth. For example, you'd hear people say the at-risk youth are youth maybe in Majengo in Mombasa who are unemployed, maybe Muslims, and mostly men, as Sheikh Lithome said.
My name is Mohamed Omar. I work with Wajir Paralegals Network. I want just to give a brief overview on CVE work in Mandera and Wajir. So as an organization, we look into CVE work starting from 2016. Initially, we have been much focused on documentation of extrajudicial killings and forceful disappearance, and holding the government accountable. For example, we had supported 13 victims in Wajir, KDF victims, in constitutional petition number 13 of 2013. And the case was, the judgment was in favor of the victims where they were given compensations. So this is the first kind of precedent that has happened in northeastern Kenya, where the government has allowed to compensate victims of KDF on on cases of human rights abuses. So in 2016, we felt like we are doing a lot of documentations on forceful disappearance and holding the government accountable. But on the other hand, we had no data on the number of people who have been recruited to the Al-Shabaabs, or who are the vulnerable groups, and such kind of things. So we have been informed to conduct a CVE work that is guided basically on two objectives, and the two objectives, that is, increasing the level of communities' awareness and sensitization on CVE, not only communities but also stakeholders, so that this can enable mitigate the risk of radicalization. Secondly is influence government, specifically the security agencies, approach in countering violence or terrorism. We felt like the approach used by the government security apparatus is more of causing damages in terms of the communities, in terms of building communities' intelligence, in terms of building the relationship between security agents and the local communities. Because we felt like the community should not fear the security agencies, but should provide relevant information. So those kind of things were not there.